Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh declares the end of intra-Palestinian conflict and the formation of a unity government in 5 weeks. Russia warns it will retaliate if its interests are attacked in Ukraine, as Kiev authorities end Easter truce with anti-government activists. And Lebanon's parliament fails to elect a new president in the first round of voting. Hello there, you're watching Al Ittijah World News and I'm Fatima Basim. Rival Palestinian factions have reached a historic agreement to end the almost 7-year rift during a reconciliation meeting in the Gaza Strip. The accord between Hamas and Fatah includes holding elections within 6 months and a formation of a unity government. Our Gaza correspondent Balsam Al-Atrash has the details.
هذه بشرى نزفها لشعبنا الفلسطيني في الوطن والشتات انتهاء مرحلة وسنوات الانقسام.
The announcement made by the Gaza-based Hamas leader was met with a joyous cheer. The historic agreement has been signed between the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Hamas, which entails the formation of a unity government.
We reiterate that the presidential, parliamentary and provincial elections will be held simultaneously, whereby the president will be authorized to fix the date of the elections, provided that the elections shall be held not more than 6 months from the formation of the government.
Today we can say that we agreed about all that we have discussed, so we will forget what happened in the past. The result of the efforts that we have made is clear today, and we have agreed on all of the points that we discussed.
The parties agreed to begin 5 weeks of talks on the establishment of a national unity government, and only thereafter to discuss a date for elections within 6 months and the distribution of government portfolios in a unified PLO leadership, which for the first time will include Hamas and the Islamic Jihad resistance groups. While the leaders from Hamas, Fatah and other groups have agreed on an accord which is based primarily on the agreements signed by the factions in Cairo and in Doha in 2011 and 2012 respectively. The implementation of the reconciliation deal could not have come any sooner for many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
If there will be an agreement between Fatah and Hamas, I'm sure that the situation will be better.
All the Palestinian people are waiting for reconciliation. The institutions, the crossings, women, children, old people, young people are waiting for reconciliation. We will have a life with dignity when there will be reconciliation.
However cordial the reconciliation meeting was and the optimistic atmosphere the gathering created for the Palestinians, it remains suspect if the two most powerful Palestinian parties, Hamas or Fatah, can actually act on their agreement and unify their stance to end this dark chapter in Palestine's history. The national unity has been announced. However, the next upcoming days will determine the seriousness of both sides in implementing the understandings they agreed upon. Balsam Al-Atrash, Al Ittijah TV, Gaza.
Meanwhile, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the cancellation of Wednesday's talks with the Palestinians. The statement followed a reconciliation agreement between rival Palestinian factions. Earlier in the day, Fatah and Hamas pledged to form a unity government and hold elections in 6 months. Dr. Mukhaymar Abu Sada, a professor at Azhar University, joins us now from Gaza. Dr. Mukhaymar, even if they will be able to form a unity government, will Palestinian factions be able to sit down together and reconcile their many differences?
Now, we hope that the announcement by both Hamas and Fatah today that a national unity government or a government of technocrats will be established in 5 weeks will be a positive step in ending the Palestinian political divide and restoring Palestinian unity. This government, if it is formed within the next 5 weeks, will be able to prepare for future Palestinian parliamentary and legislative elections and put the Palestinians on the right direction toward restoring their unity and basically ending the division once and for all. It all depends on whether the Palestinian president and both Hamas and Fatah will be able to form a new government in the next 5 weeks or not. So the whole thing depends on their agreement on the formation of a new government.
But how will this agreement translate into bettering the living conditions of the Palestinians?
Now, it was stated in the press conference today that the Palestinians, both in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, are experiencing difficult conditions. In the West Bank, the Palestinians are facing Israeli settlement expansion, roadblocks and other Israeli aggressive measures. And also the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been facing an Israeli siege and blockade for almost 7 years now, and rising levels of poverty and unemployment. Now we hope that the new government will be able to put an end to the siege and blockade imposed on Gaza and will basically give assurances to the Egyptian government to open the Rafah border crossing, the only crossing between Gaza and the outside world. So we do really hope that the next coming Palestinian government will put an end to the suffering or the daily suffering of the Palestinians, mainly in the Gaza Strip.
And to what degree will foreign players have a hand here, considering that a lot of these groups' funding comes from the outside?
Well, both parties, Hamas and Fatah, know that there will be difficulties ahead of them, and that's why both Hamas and Fatah are looking for Arab support to lend their support to the next Palestinian government. They are basically concerned that maybe the Israeli government will try to spoil the reconciliation agreement and will try to sabotage this agreement by withholding Palestinian taxes and customs, and also by punishing the Palestinians, as it was stated by Israeli Prime Minister today, by canceling peace talks with the Palestinians. And also there will be a cabinet meeting for the Israeli government tomorrow to decide how to deal with the Palestinian coming government. Basically, without Arab support, without international support for the coming government, it will be very hard for the Palestinians to overcome their daily problems and daily conditions.
And where will this place the PA's recognition ambitions within the international community, considering that Hamas is classified as a terrorist organization by certain states?
Well, this is a very good question, and it's an issue that has basically has been a big problem over the past 7 years. Now, the government that will be established, it is expected to be a government of independence or a government of technocrats, which is not going to include factional or senior leaders from Hamas or Fatah. It will be made of Palestinian specialists, Palestinian technocrats, which will be accepted by the international community. But the US has made it clear today that any coming Palestinian government will have to recognize Israel, or basically it will have to recognize the quartet, 3 conditions: recognizing Israel, renouncing terrorism, and accepting previous agreements between the PLO and Israel. Without that, it will be hard for the next government to be approved by the international community, and mainly by the US and the European Union.
Now, the Israelis have already shown its anger at this latest move. Will it work further to sabotage Palestinian unity within this short framework of 5 weeks?
Well, the Israeli response came very fast. While there was a press conference today in Gaza announcing the achievement of this deal between Hamas and Fatah, Israel targeted a Palestinian resistance fighter and injured other 4 Palestinians. Israel is definitely will try to sabotage this reconciliation agreement by either trying to escalate the situation with the Gaza Strip, or basically trying to prohibit the facilitation or the movement of the next government. But at least if the next Palestinian government is able to get the support of the international community, that will put pressure on Israel not to fight against the government or not to basically boycott it. So it's up for the next government, and it's up for its political program to try to get the support of the international community and the quartet. And by doing that, it will deprive Israel from any excuses to sabotage it or to try to fail it.
Now, Netanyahu clearly stated today that Fatah needs to choose its peace partner. So is this President Abbas finally giving up on talks with Tel Aviv?
Now, it seems to me that the chances of any peace negotiations between the Palestinians and Israel are not really there. The Palestinian Israelis have been negotiating for 9 months, and nothing has been achieved, no progress whatsoever with regard to the final status issues, Palestinian refugees, Jerusalem settlement, future security arrangements. The whole process has very much collapsed as a result of the Israeli decision not to release Palestinian prisoners, or the 4th stage of the Palestinian prisoners. So basically, nothing to be expected from the peace negotiations with Israel, and that is one of the factors which pushed both parties, Hamas and Fatah, to achieve this reconciliation deal today.
Now, you mentioned there Egypt's role in these talks, but do you really see the reopening of the Rafah border crossing as an option, considering that it did outlaw Hamas earlier this year?
Well, we are aware of the fact that the Egyptian current regime has classified the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. They also classified Hamas as a banned group in the Gaza Strip. But let me also make it clear that the Egyptians have not disconnected all of their relationship with the Egyptians. Musa Abu Marzouk, the deputy of Khalid Mish'al, the leader of Hamas, is still based in Cairo, and he was allowed to travel from Cairo to the Gaza Strip to facilitate the signing of this reconciliation deal between Hamas and Fatah. And the Egyptians have made it clear to the Palestinians that Rafah will be open once there will be a national unity government or a new government. So it seems to me that the Egyptians will make good on their promises when it comes to opening Rafah once there will be a new Palestinian government in the West Bank and Gaza.
All right, Dr. Mukhaymer Abu Sada, professor at Al-Azhar University, thank you for speaking to Ali Tuja. The Lebanese parliament has failed to elect a new president for the country in the first round of voting and has scheduled a second session for next week. Our Beirut correspondent Hussein Al-Mousari reports on the day's highly charged events.
Naila Twaini, Antoine Saad.
The clash of the March 14 and March 8 coalitions has prevented the Lebanese parliament from filling a potential presidential vacuum. A parliament session convened to elect a new president for the country failed to name a new president, as none of the candidates received the 2/3 majority needed to win.
عدد المغلفات 124 المتطابق مع العدد الموجود في القاعة. يبدأ الفرز.
Parliament Speaker Nabih Birri announced the results and scheduled the second round of voting for April 30th.
عدد الأوراق كما قلنا 124.
124 MPs voted today. Blank papers 52. Dr. Samir Jaja 48 votes. Henri Al-Hulu 16 votes and 7 void votes. The first round has ended. The next round will be held next week on April 30th at 12 p.m.
The countenance of the controversial candidate Lebanese Forces Chief Samir Jaja, who received the official backing of the March 14 alliance, evidently expressed his disappointment at his loss.
We were surprised with the number of blank votes. What happened to the strong candidate they were calling for? We will continue with the elections and we will attend the second round as a united camp.
Outside Parliament, lawmakers expressed to Al-Ittijah TV their mixed feeling towards today's session and the possible outcome of next week's vote.
It is a white paper.
Yes, and does this mean that it's the end of Jaja's candidacy?
Yes, I think now we have to go seriously to choose the Lebanese president. Thank you.
The Parliament Speaker said next week will be another session. How will the session, do you think, will play out?
No comment now.
The March 14 will meet very soon to decide how to continue this combat. It was not the combat of Samir Jaja, it was the plan of 14th of March, and it will stay the plan of 14th of March. 14th of March is continuing the combat, but we are going to discuss how to continue for the coming round in a week.
And finally, do you think before May 25th we will see a president, or we have to wait for these Syrian elections?
No, I am sure we'll see a president. We need a president. We cannot get to the vacuum. A vacuum will be very dangerous for all what we succeed to do in the last 2 months.
Meanwhile, the March 8th coalition's expected candidate MP Michel Aoun has yet to officially announce his bid for the presidential post. An MP from the Free Patriotic Movement told Al-Ittijah TV that Aoun remains a genuine candidate.
Yes, we respect democracy in Lebanon, we respect the constitution.
And why do you think Samir Jaja portrayed himself as a candidate, although he knows he will lose?
This is his right.
Yes.
His right to run the presidency, and he knew that he will lose.
Okay, and will the next session, will Aoun be a candidate?
Michel Aoun?
Yes.
Yes, he will be the candidate of a compromise, a big compromise, Lebanese compromise between the two factions in Lebanon, 14 and 8. Then we can solve our problem. We can go to a new president, great president, and we go to a prime minister. Great prime minister is Saad al-Hariri, and the great president.
The Lebanese presidential election drama looks set to drag on for quite some time, leaving the country grappling with a void which many contend is manageable, considering that the president, who under convention must be a Christian Maronite and serves a 6-year term, holds little to no real powers. Now and after Parliament, as expected, failed to elect a new president, all eyes will be set on next week's session, which according to analysts will also fail to elect a new president. Outside the Parliament building in Beirut, Hussein Al-Musawi, Al-Ittijah TV.
Well, earlier we were joined by former Lebanese Minister Assam Naaman, and he explained that this first round of presidential elections in the Lebanese Parliament highlighted the growing divisions within the March 14 bloc.
The two main parliamentary blocs, that is the 14th of March alliance and the 8th of March coalition, agree on a certain candidate, I think it will be impossible for the Lebanese parliament to elect a president before the expiry of the present President Michel Suleiman on the 25th of May. Practically the only candidate, Mr. Jaja, because he promised himself and his supporters to get not less than 52 votes. It turned out that his own coalition partners, that is the 14th of March coalition or alliance, not all of them voted for him. At least 6 didn't vote for him. And this is a political blow for him. And I think this will, if it will not put an end to his ambition, at least it will convince the leaders of the 14th of March alliance to look for an independent candidate who can get the support of the 18th of March coalition. Elections will drag on after that particular date. And frankly, I think that unless the United States and Iran come to an agreement concerning the nuclear program of Iran, and eventually that will lead to an agreement or a compromise between Iran and Saudi Arabia, unless these two agreements materialize, then I think it will be difficult for the Lebanese to elect a president. The 14th of March alliance is waiting for a certain gesture from outside Lebanon, mainly from Saudi Arabia. And I think Saudi Arabia won't give a positive gesture to the 14th of March alliance unless they come to an agreement with the Iranians. And that depends on an agreement between the Americans and the Iranians before that. This particular cabinet will carry on. And I don't think that any reforms will be discussed before a new president is elected. Some politicians may ask for a new electoral law because the parliament's term will end on the beginning of next November. But I don't think that will work out because everybody will be working for a new president and waiting for a new president to be elected.
The Easter truce between Kiev and pro-Russian activists in the east of the country has ended, with Ukraine's acting president, Alexander Turchinov, calling for the relaunching of anti-terrorist operations. This as Moscow warned of a response should its interests in the territory be threatened.
Russia warned that it will retaliate if it was attacked, and its legitimate interests in eastern Ukraine were threatened. In an interview with Russia Today, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Russian citizens being attacked is an attack against the Russian Federation, warning that his country will respond in line with international law.
If we are attacked, we would certainly respond. If our interests, legitimate interests, the interests of Russians have been attacked directly, like they were in South Ossetia, for example, I don't see any other way but to respond in full accordance with international law. Russian citizens being attacked is an attack against the Russian Federation.
The warning was issued following Ukraine's announcement to end an Easter truce and relaunch so-called anti-terrorist operations against pro-Russia activists in the eastern regions. Ukraine's acting First Deputy Prime Minister, for his part, said appropriate measures were being taken against the activists.
The active stage of the anti-terror operation is continuing. Law enforcement bodies are working on the destruction of gangster groups in Kramatorsk, Slovyansk and other cities in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions.
On Tuesday, acting President Alexander Turchinov announced the resumption of the so-called anti-terrorist operation in eastern Ukraine. These crimes are being carried out with the full support and indulgence of the Russian Federation. I call on the security agencies to relaunch and carry out effective anti-terrorist measures with the aim of protecting Ukrainian citizens living in eastern Ukraine from terrorists. The Russian warning came a day after the U.S. Vice President Joe Biden ended his two-day visit to Ukraine, the highest-profile U.S. politician to have traveled to the country. According to Moscow, It was no coincidence that the resumption of operations came after Biden's visit, implying that Washington is directly involved in the current crisis in eastern Ukraine.
The Russian army has conducted military drills near its border with Ukraine, using its latest military hardware. The exercises follow a warning from Moscow of a response should its interests be threatened in Ukraine. This footage shows a Russian military unit carrying cannons, multiple rocket launchers and S-300 surface-to-air missiles in the Rostov region. The drills come on the heels of a decision by the authorities in Kiev to resume so-called anti-terrorist operations in the country's east against pro-Russian activists. Let's now speak to Balkans expert Marko Gasic, who joins us now from London. Mr. Gasic, are we going to see a Georgia-style scenario being played out in eastern Ukraine?
I don't think so, but I think it really depends on how high the stakes are that the US wishes to play for. Because clearly the US wants hawks, not doves, in Kiev, and they've sent in the last 10 days, they've sent the head of the CIA, John Brennan, and now the Vice President, Joe Biden, to turn the Kievan authorities into the hawks that they would like, because that will actually make the situation worse, because it threatens to provoke a worse conflict. I think that the US motivation here is to create a new zone of geopolitical instability in order that they can project their power there, which they've already done in half of Ukraine, and also so that they can lock in the loyalty or the obedience of the European Union countries through the mechanism of NATO, because now they will wave the imagined phantom of the Russian bear in order to persuade everybody that they should be part of NATO and listening to everything that the US tells them to do. I think that's what's going on here. And so really it's up to the US to de-escalate the situation, because so far all it's done is to escalate the situation by destabilizing, as we know, the legitimately elected original governments in Ukraine, and by constantly arguing for force to be used in the situation, as is apparent in the visit of Joe Biden today.
Yes, but is Kiev trying to provoke Russia's intervention to serve Western interests?
Well, it does appear that way, because the rhetoric of the Kievan authorities, now that the US is there to bolster them, the rhetoric of the Kievan authorities is quite remarkable. They're talking about liquidating the protesters they were talking about yesterday, the protesters in the south and east, who are, after all, Ukrainian citizens. And they were also, Yatsenyuk himself on the 17th of March actually said the very ground will burn under their feet. So I'm reminded now of what Colonel Gaddafi in Libya said before he was bombed by the very same Western powers. So now Yatsenyuk is sounding very much like the colonel, the late colonel, but Yatsenyuk is not getting bombed by the US, he's getting a pat on the back and encouraged to carry on in the same way. So yes, this rhetoric that the Kievan self-proclaimed authorities are coming out with is very inflammatory, and I'm not surprised that Russia is talking of its right to react if Russian interests and people are threatened in practice.
Now, it's very interesting how you mentioned there these anti-terrorist operations started after the visit of CIA Chief John Brennan and resumed again following Joe Biden's visit to Kiev. Could we say that the US is the one running the show here?
I think it is. I mean, it's clear that it is, because Europe seems to be very silent at the moment. And we should remember that on February the 21st, there was a European Union deal which was brokered to solve the problem, at least to some extent. And that was really stopped by the far right in Kiev, the fascist element, the Pravi sector, as they're called. And really, nobody in the US seems to have objected to the torpedoing of the European peace plan in Ukraine. I mean, we have precedents for US torpedoing peace plans in other parts of the world, notably Yugoslavia, where European Union initiatives were constantly undermined by American interference until the Europeans accepted that the Americans should get the credit for any peace that broke out. So I think the US has a well-trodden strategy in these situations, and it does use them in order to project its own power into very far-away corners of the world. It's a transatlantic superpower which is projecting itself into Asia and into the far corners of Europe because it's to its advantage to do so.
All right, I'm going to have to
say that the Russians are perfectly entitled to talk about a response because we have the American own precedent to call upon. We know that in 1983, for example, the Americans attacked Grenada because there was a coup and because there was political instability and because there were American citizens, about 200 of them, in Grenada at the time, and the Americans felt that that made them entitled to attack the whole country and take it over. Now, the Russians are not talking about doing that, but the Americans are still objecting to anything that the Russians say because the Americans seem to believe that there should be one international law for the West and another for the rest.
All right, I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you for speaking to Al-Ittijah Balkans expert Marco Gasic.
Thank you.
You're watching Al-Ittijah World News, still to come. Anti-nuclear protesters scuffle with police. Welcome back to Al-Ittijah World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh declares the end of intra-Palestinian conflict and the formation of a unity government in 5 weeks. Russia warns it will retaliate if its interests are attacked in Ukraine as Kiev authorities end Easter truce with anti-government activists. And Lebanon's parliament fails to elect a new president in the first round of voting. As the Bahraini revolution heads well into its 4th year, clashes broke out between Bahraini security forces and anti-government protesters during a funeral procession held for 2 slain youths west of the capital Manama on Tuesday.
Clouds of tear gas blocked the view in Bahrain and suffocated protesters when Saudi-backed security forces fired the toxic substance at angry demonstrators west of the capital Manama. Government forces also fired shotgun pellets and caused injuries among a crowd of protesters. A heavy-handed crackdown targeting anti-regime protesters was sanctioned by the government as police attacked a funeral procession held in the village of Mashka for 2 teenage activists. Thousands of mourners marched behind the coffins of Ali Abbas and Ahmed al-Musajjan, who were killed on Saturday in a car bomb attack. The vehicle was completely torched and only one of the passengers survived, but remains in a critical condition. The Bahraini February 14th Youth Coalition, which has been leading demonstrations since the beginning of the 2011 uprising, accused security forces of killing the 2 activists for participating in peaceful anti-government rallies. Meanwhile, gunmen surrounded the village of Sar and carried out house raids. At least 9 people were arrested. Nearly daily confrontations occur between Bahraini security forces and protesters who have taken up the task of fighting for their rights and freedoms in a country where authorities often use force to muffle the voice of the opposition.
Bahraini authorities have expelled the official representative of the Iraqi Shia cleric Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. Sheikh Hussein al-Najati was among 31 Bahrainis whose citizenships were revoked in 2012. Human rights organizations have condemned the move by the Bahraini government as an act of sectarian oppression. Qatar has broken a nearly week-long silence after it agreed to end disputes with neighboring GCC member states during a ministerial meeting in Riyadh.
Good fences make good neighbors, but in the Persian Gulf it takes more than borders to qualify as a good neighbor. During a press conference with his Kuwaiti counterpart Sheikh Sabah Khalid Sabah, Qatar's foreign minister Khalid Al-Atiyah made the first statement regarding the GCC ministerial meeting, which was held in Riyadh last week. Qatar's top diplomat said the statement issued in Riyadh on April 17th was clear. For the brothers in the Gulf Cooperation Council, the dispute is over. Brothers in the GCC states arrived at understandings which are not considered to be concessions by any party. Foreign ministers of the so-called Gulf Cooperation Council met last week in Riyadh in a bid to put out tensions between Qatar on the one hand and Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain on the other. Riyadh, Abu Dhabi and Manama recalled their ambassadors from Doha after accusing Qatar of meddling in their internal affairs and supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Despite the apparent resolution of the political clash, these states' ambassadors have not returned to the shunned neighbor, which has left the matter in their hands. No further details have been provided over the hush-hush meeting, which stipulated that these Persian Gulf states respect the interests, security and stability of one another.
A car bomb detonated near an Iraqi village north of the city of Mosul, killing at least 7 people and wounding at least 13 others. Iraq has been struggling with daily violence ahead of parliamentary elections next week. The surge in bloodshed has killed more than 2,750 people this year alone. US President Barack Obama arrived in Tokyo, launching his tour of Asia. Obama is looking to strengthen the rebalancing of US foreign policy towards the Asia-Pacific region. Following his arrival, Obama met with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and held talks over a sushi dinner. The visit comes amid growing regional tensions over maritime territorial disputes between China and Japan, as well as fears over the escalating situation on the Korean Peninsula. Anti-nuclear activists scuffled with police during a protest in front of Taiwan's ruling Nationalist Party headquarters in Taipei City. The demonstration comes in protest over the constructions of the island's 4th nuclear power plant, another developing challenge for the country's already beleaguered president. On Tuesday, a high-profile Taiwanese anti-nuclear activist began a hunger strike and vowed to carry on with it until the government suspends the construction of the northern Taipei plant. Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro has announced a new offensive to tackle the country's ailing economy. The move comes in a bid to address the main reasons driving the ongoing anti-government protests.
Increase production, eradicate scarcity, and control speculation by enforcing fair prices. These are the 3 key objectives Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has in mind for his country's economy. Following a meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, President Maduro outlined a new offensive, including new fixed prices for basic products and further economic regulations for the Venezuelan economy.
I ask that we take on this offensive together. This plan will only succeed if we can rely on the workers' support and those businesses that have a nationalist mentality. No one should wager its failure. The new economic offensive should bring prosperity to the people and the country.
calling upon the Venezuelan people to reclaim pride in national productivity and to promote a healthy work ethic among their communities. Maduro also mentioned the need for departure from what he called the parasitic model, making reference to illicit profit-making schemes that exploit government subsidies. Since taking office April of 2013, Maduro has faced a tanking economy, soaring crime, food shortages, and deadly protests. With the supply of dollars drying up as oil production wanes, imports have fallen and shortages have hit record levels as the country experiences a time of slow economic growth and rising prices. Although Maduro says the new economic reforms are coming as soon as next week, it is unclear how effective they will be at stifling inflation and reviving productivity during what many call the onset of an economic crisis that has been the main driver of deadly protests shaking the country over the past 3 months.
Well, earlier, Ali Tijas Between the Lines hosted John Coop, the former director of the British Council in Caracas, and he says that the Maduro government will have to be more inclusive.
I think we must bear in mind that the middle and the upper classes, as you call them, have seen their country going towards economic ruin in their view, and so that is obviously fueling this discontent. And I think we must also bear in mind that in allegations of violence by the opposition, that the Venezuelan armed forces number 300,000 soldiers and airmen and naval people, and there are 600,000 in the armed reserves. So I don't think the Venezuelan government is any danger of being overthrown by military force. And of course, the Catholic Church has come into this equation recently. Well, I think maybe you're coming upon a new factor here about the split within the Chavista government between the two wings, those people who are in favor of Maduro and those people who probably might back Cabello, who is perhaps more extreme. And the military are more likely to tilt towards Cabello, in my view. The Venezuelan government must make a much bigger effort to talk seriously to the opposition and bring them into the process. Without that, disaster looms. That is certain. They must do this, and they must also start squaring the Catholic Church, because its recent outpouring accusing the government of totalitarianism and brutal repression is also extremely damaging. So the church must be squared, the opposition must be brought into the process, and foreign governments must help even to a greater degree in this negotiation process. So far it's been a bit lukewarm, to tell you the truth. I think foreign governments, particularly Latin American ones, need to do more, and perhaps the United Nations needs to do more. UNASUR doesn't seem to have the stomach for it.
Afghanistan's preliminary presidential election results have been delayed due to fraud investigations, and according to officials will now be released on Saturday as they attempt to filter out illegitimate votes.
The 7 million Afghani voters waiting anxiously for the results of their country's presidential elections will now have to wait a little bit longer. Afghanistan's Election Commission has delayed a planned release of full results from the April 5th vote to allow for recounts and audits. The announcement further raises confusion surrounding the poll to replace President Hamid Karzai, who is ineligible for a third term. The results were expected on Thursday, but the director of the Independent Election Commission said they would be postponed until at least Saturday to ensure they are not tainted by fraud. The preliminary results then must be investigated by a separate commission before being finalized by May 14. So far, partial results of about half the 7 million votes cast show former Foreign Minister Abdullah Abdullah in the lead, and ex-Finance Minister Ashraf Ghani trailing in second place. It remains unclear if either candidate will be able to secure a majority to avoid a runoff.
So, as Chairman Nooristani said,
though there have been allegations of vote rigging, the fact that elections were held in the country was itself hailed a success by Afghan officials and foreign allies, considering the Taliban failed to launch a major attack despite a series of threats to disrupt the vote.
The deteriorating security situation in Yemen has only put more pressure on the already dire state of the country's economy. Our Sana'a correspondent Mohammed Al-Attab takes a look now at the people who are feeling the brunt of the economic hardship.
A spike in terrorist attacks across Yemen has only added to the already deteriorating security situation, putting further pressure on the country's stagnant economy. While Yemen's economy is almost entirely dependent on oil exports, economists like Ahmed Shammar say that only 2% of the population has benefited from the country's oil wealth.
Yemen is suffering from a budget deficit which gets worse every year. Yemen is in the top 10 of the world's poorest countries according to the international reports and is in the first in terms of corruption.
Farouk is just one of many victims of the chronic poverty that plagues Yemen. Along with his wife and daughter, Farouk has been living in this tiny room for years.
After I finished high school, I enrolled in the military. Later on, I was discharged from the service and then worked as a laborer to make a living. I was doing okay before I got kidney disease.
Farouk's dream of making a decent living has been steadily diminishing, especially after he found out that he was suffering from kidney disease, which prevented him from working as a laborer.
I was doing okay before I got kidney disease, which prevented me from earning a living for my family, and nowadays I'm on welfare.
Taha Al-Haddad is another victim of the rising unemployment in the country. He has been forced to resort to selling old books on the street to support his 9 family members, a practice he says is now threatened by the government's crackdown on street vendors.
After I graduated from high school, I was trying to continue my studies, but lack of income and expenses made that impossible. So I was forced to earn a living from my work here at the street selling old books.
The recent spike in attacks against oil pipelines have only added to Yemen's economy woes. Due to its heavy reliance on oil, the government has found itself with an $8 billion budget deficit. And while economic experts argue that the government has alternatives, the country's leaders have decided to lift fuel subsidies, which according to many could lead to a humanitarian crisis in the country.
An increase of fuel prices would only add insult to injury, which experts say will accompany an increase in the price of almost all essential goods. The controversial decision has left many observers insisting that the current economic crisis in Yemen may only be the tip of the iceberg. Mohammed Al-Attab, AEE TV, Sana'a.
Here's a recap of tonight's headlines. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh declares the end of intra-Palestinian conflict and the formation of a unity government in 5 weeks. Russia warns it will retaliate if its interests are attacked in Ukraine as Kiev authorities end Easter truce with anti-government activists. And Lebanon's parliament fails to elect a new president in the first round of voting. Well, that's all from me and the AEE News team. Thank you very much for watching and good night.